In this video presentation, we'll be talking about the struggle for civil rights. Information on this presentation can be found in Chapter 23, Sections 1 through 3 of your orange textbook. We're going to be dealing with Goal 11, Objectives 2 and 6. Objective 2 is trace the major events of the civil rights movement, and Objective 6 is assess consequences of political events, actions, and reactions. Our essential questions are: how did African Americans challenge segregation after World War II? And how did the civil rights movement gain ground in the 1960s? And what successes and challenges faced the civil rights movement after 1964? After World War II, African Americans were still treated as second-class citizens, despite the fact that they had served in 2 world wars. In the mid-1900s, the civil rights movement began to make some major progress in correcting the problem of racial segregation. The civil rights movement demonstrated that ordinary men and women could perform extraordinary acts of courage and sacrifice to achieve social justice. Into the 1950s, African Americans still suffered many forms of discrimination, including segregation that separated blacks and whites in hospitals, schools, restaurants, and other areas of public life. In the 1940s, some new efforts arose to try to fight these injustices, but they had limited success. The 2 types of segregation that existed are de jure segregation, that is, separation imposed by law, and de facto segregation, segregation or separation by written custom or tradition, so it's unspoken. Facilities for African Americans were not equal to those for white people. They were often run down or less sophisticated. CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, was founded by civil rights leader James Farmer. It was an interracial organization that confronted urban segregation in the North. And this, again, was segregation that was more unspoken because they didn't have Jim Crow laws in the North. But still, segregation was quite apparent. The violence of 1943 revealed to many Americans, both blacks and whites, the seriousness of the racial tensions in the U.S. and not just in the South. In 1954, the NAACP push to end segregation in schools finally had some major success with Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. Thurgood Marshall was a Supreme Court justice who became very well known in the 1950s and 60s. He had a law degree from the very respected Howard University, which was an African American university. He was the great-grandson of a slave. Most importantly, he led the NAACP legal team to attack segregation. He did this using the court system. In 1938 to 1961, his NAACP team won 29 of the 32 cases that went before the Supreme Court, which is amazingly successful. And in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education ended segregation in the public schools. Following that, in 1961, John F. Kennedy nominated him to the U.S. Court of Appeals. And in 1967, he became the first African American Supreme Court justice. Thurgood Marshall began to focus on desegregating the nation's elementary and high schools beginning in the 1950s. He found a case in Linda Brown of Topeka, Kansas. What he did was combine a number of school segregation cases from around the country into one single case known as Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. The Supreme Court was very aware of the importance that was riding on this case. They heard arguments over a 2-year period, and the court also considered research about segregation's effect on African American children. This included the black doll, white doll study, which we'll learn about in class. In 1954, Chief Justice Earl Warren, considered one of the most liberal Chief Justices ever, issued a Supreme Court's decision on Brown versus Board of Education. In it, all 9 justices unanimously agreed that separate schools for African Americans and whites violated the Constitution's guarantee of equal protection under the law. It ruled that separate was not equal. These pictures show the first day after the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education. The picture in the bottom left is the first day of school after the decision, September 8th, 1954, in Fort Myer Elementary School in Virginia. This map shows school segregation in 1952, and you can see that the area in pink is where legal segregation was required. So schools had to be segregated. In contrast, the yellow area shows areas where legal segregation was prohibited. So some of the northern states actually prohibited segregation. The green states represent places where segregation is permitted but not required. In the next video, we'll talk about how federal and state governments clashed when it came to desegregating or integrating public schools.